Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Bridges of Belonging. If you need to turn the camera. We are very excited to have you here and to do yet another week. This is the 7th conversation, and this is always a beautiful conversation. I'm super excited to have Janice and Beth with us today. So I want to start off by doing a territory acknowledgement. I've been really grateful to be a guest on Coast Salish territory with the Songhees and Esquimalt nations, especially over these last few months of being here completely and feeling really safe, and I'm grateful for the great stewardship that the First Nations people have shown us in keeping us safe and healthy over this really challenging time of our lives. And we are in the last day of Indigenous History Month here in Canada, and so it seems really timely to just take a moment and make sure that you're aware of what territory you're on and learn a little bit about that. And I'm sure that'll probably come up a little bit as we go through our conversation today. So just in terms of housekeeping, if people can stay muted and cameras off during the main presentation, but we certainly welcome comments in the chat box and questions as we go through, and about halfway through we'll open it up and start answering some of those questions. So I just want to kick off with a reading as we do each week. This week I'm reading from Richard Wagamese Ember's book, and I just really love this whole book. So I read the first week from Richard Wagamese and I'm reading again today. So here we go. Unity cannot exist when exclusion is allowed to occur. I was graced with this teaching years ago when I was working as a traditional elder's helper. The teaching has given me in the context of the sacred pipe, but its intention was to help me understand community. What brings us together cannot exist in the same time and place as what keeps us apart. You, me, everyone. My choice is to be aware of our similarities, our yearning for truth, peace, love, belonging, welcome, grace, mercy, a God of our own understanding, and at least one moment of real contact at the heart of every day. Seeing that I am made more, included, extended, and in harmony until that moment when I no longer see. So with that, we are going to move to introducing our two speakers today. And I've had the great privilege of working with both of these women on a few different occasions over the last number of years, and so excited for you to hear and learn from them today. So I'm going to introduce Janice Forsyth first. Janice is a member of the River Cree First Nation in Manitoba. She's an award-winning scholar whose research, service, and advocacy focuses on Indigenous sport development and in Canada. And her work combines history and sociology to explore the relationship between sport and culture from Indigenous points of view. Her work has informed policy and programs across sectors including youth and community development, justice, education, citizenship, health, in addition to sport and physical activity. She's a co-editor for Aboriginal Peoples in Sport in Canada, Historical Foundations and Contemporary Issues, and recently released her book, Reclaiming Tom Longboat, Indigenous Self-Determination in Canada. She's an associate professor of sociology and the director of Indigenous Studies at Western University in London, Ontario. And I just told her that I had ordered the book a few weeks ago, and it came in yesterday, but I haven't had a chance to pick it up yet. So super excited to be able to do that, and look forward to reading your book, Janice. And Beth Hudson is traditionally from Sucker Creek First Nation in Treaty 8. She was born and raised in Edmonton, Alberta. Growing up, Beth was frequently the only Indigenous person in the room and felt isolated and alone in most areas of her life. Always an active kid, she found community and connection through sport and recreation, and pursued this passion through university and grad school, eventually finding home in the Northwest Territories. She loves to help build capacity and opportunity for Indigenous youth by creating innovative strategies for overcoming the systemic and societal barriers that impact Indigenous communities. Beth continues to inspire change in the communities she works with. She's helped develop content for national programs and training for Aboriginal sport and has networked with a number of sport bodies in an effort to inspire change and use sport and recreation as a tool to help Indigenous youth overcome barriers. And we're going to have Beth kick us off today. So Beth, why don't you tell us a little bit more about you?
Okay, perfect. You can hear me all good. Awesome. Okay, so I mean, that kind of sums up a lot of it right there, which is awesome. But yes, I'm so happy to be here today. My name is Beth Hudson. I currently work as the Leadership Development Coordinator for the Aboriginal Sports Circle of the Northwest Territories. I'm currently located in Yellowknife in the Northwest Territories, which is located on Chief Draggie's territory, which is Treaty 11. If that's the way you like to identify, and currently on a wonderful territory that is Denendeh, and I love being here. It's a wonderful place to work and to live. It's amazing to live somewhere where, you know, we work with a lot of Indigenous communities across the Northwest Territories in so many different regions and so many different climates. It's been amazing to be able to really connect back to not only the land, but traditional games, and explore both kind of the contemporary and traditional side of sport, which was a big part of the research and education that I focused my grad school on. And a lot of my education and experience is kind of revolve around that duality, that binary of kind of existing in one world and the other, and what that means in between. So it's been really, really interesting to work in an area where I get to kind of merge those ideas and hopefully support others along the way. And so that's really what I'm passionate about and what I do now. And my focus in the Northwest Territories is just working with communities and working with Indigenous youth to just hopefully come up with ways to find strategies to overcome those barriers, which you can imagine, you know, youth living in rural, isolated, small communities, there's a lot of them. So it's a lot of fun and it's really exciting. And yeah, I'm always excited to talk about it.
That's awesome. What great energy to kick us off today. Thank you. Over to you, Janice, to introduce yourself.
Sure. So like Beth, I'd like to thank you, Carrie, for the invitation. And I'd also like to thank everybody who took the time out to be here today. It's nice to have discussions about belonging in sport, and I like the concept of belonging because it forces us into a new headspace to think about how we relate to one another. A little bit more about me. I'm as Andrea said, I'm a member of the Fisher River Cree First Nation, which is about 2 hours north of Winnipeg in Manitoba. And on my mother's side, they tend to come from Fisher River, and on the men's side, they tend to come from Peguis. I mostly grew up in Northern Ontario, though, or in Timmins, and I say mostly because we moved around a lot, literally every year until I was in high school. I spent some time up in Pickle Lake in Northern Ontario, which is a remote community, and for a while we lived in Alberta, in Lethbridge, and in a very small town called New Dayton on the border of Montana, population 50. So so I tend to say Timmins because people need one place, I think, when they ask you where you're from. I think my formative years growing up were really influenced by my grandmother, and she went to Brandon Indian Residential School. And when she came out, she worked in a logging camp and then as a cleaner at a hotel in Timmins for many, many years, and saved up for money and put me in sports that poor kids probably shouldn't be in, or that shouldn't be in, but you typically don't see them in: figure skating, ballet, horseback riding. And I think a lot of those experiences heighten my awareness of what it means to be poor and what it means to be Indigenous in these spaces where you typically didn't see either. So I think it was really my early formative years that shaped my kind of my life trajectory and why I do what I do now.
Thank you. So tell us a little bit more about that, Janice. Tell us about some of your sport experiences and how those felt for you, and how it facilitated your pathway to then being such an incredible scholar and researcher around Indigenous sport experiences.
Thanks. I don't often talk about myself. It was funny. I was having a conversation with this about someone the other day, and I think it's partly because I've had some really horrific experiences about explaining my story to people who just don't listen and who don't even want to understand. So I'm often quite reticent to do that kind of emotional labor. I applaud people who do it, because I think they have to have a very deep love, for wanting to do that kind of emotional labor. But for me, it was feeling out of place in places where I felt like I should belong, in figure skating, ballet, and horseback riding. It's not to say that I didn't make some friends when I was there. Absolutely, I did. And but at the same time, it was also quite an isolating experience, being the outsider to some extent, not being able to afford all of the things that the other kids could afford, and also being identified as the Indian at times. And I can't quite remember what all of that experience was like. I mean, I don't know who in this room can remember their youth. It comes in glimpses and snippets, and oftentimes only when I'm looking back at photographs do I have some sort of visceral memory of what that was like. When my parents passed away, of course, I got all of their photos, and I've organized them. Being the geeky historian and researcher that I am, I put them all in little plastic baggies and labeled them. But it was really weird going through kind of my childhood, looking back, and just remembering the odd spaces, the complex spaces that these places provided me, and like I said, that really heightened my awareness of who I was. And at the same time, I wasn't really aware of it when I was younger, but I did have a stronger sense of it growing up into my teens, and especially as a researcher in university, of why my grandmother and why my parents put so much stock, in having me in these sports, out of all of the things that they could have spent their money on, like a mortgage, right, on a down payment on a house or a car. They put me in these sports that cost thousands and thousands a year. And the best that I can come up with is that they valued providing me with opportunities that they themselves didn't have, and them, either consciously or unconsciously valuing the mainstreaming effect it would have, hanging out with all of these rich white kids, basically, thinking that somehow it would, be the right place for me and help make life better. So they, like a lot of people, they emotionally get attached to sport, and there's, very real effects that flow from that around class and race and gender, and what kind of opportunities, kids can then parlay that into, or families can parlay that into. So there's obviously a more complicated story behind all of this, and I can certainly share that as we go along, but that's more about my story.
Thank you, Janice, and I'm grateful that you're open to sharing today. I know that some of these are challenging conversations, but I know that each time I've had the opportunity to work with you and learn from you, it's been a really rich experience, and I hope that for our audience today as well. Beth, how about you? I mean, you in your bio and in your introduction talked about sort of the importance of capacity building and leadership development and sport in your life. Share a little bit more about sort of what that pathways looked like for you and why you value that so much.
Yeah, I guess I'll just get right into it then. So I think for a lot of us, by us, I mean kind of Indigenous peoples, and our experience of sport, at least those kind of more involved in the world, share a very similar experience around finding that sense of belonging in sport. We know that already. And of course, as Janice has said, there's so many complex issues that kind of come into play here when we have these discussions. So I'm definitely going to try my best to keep it focused on what we're talking about here. And so in terms of, the sense of belonging that I found through sport, my story has really been, yes, I know where my traditional lands are from, but as I hinted in the bio, I was raised by non-Indigenous parents in a non-Indigenous family in a non-Indigenous urban center. So I was adopted straight out of the hospital in Edmonton from an infant, and I'm very lucky actually that the way it happened for me wasn't as traumatic for community and for my family, I think, as a lot of stories are. You know, my birth mother was very lucky to have a little bit of autonomy in what she was able to do, and I'm grateful for that. And she was able to really find the place that was best for me at the time. And I think that that's, you know, a very loaded, you know, topic for sure. I certainly love, you know, talking about it and exploring it. But again, there's so many layers to that simple conversation as well. And so, you know, my parents who raised me, I was once again lucky in a lot of ways where they were very much, their goal wasn't to have me fit in. I think they always wanted me to fit in. But I think early on, they kind of realized that I never would. And I didn't know if they had ever quite figured out why that would be. So certainly interesting kind of growing up without the context behind it. So, you know, I didn't have a ton of exposure to my culture. I didn't have a ton of exposure to my birth family or my community, but my parents really tried to foster that sense of, you know, belonging to my culture and knowing where I came from. So it was never a secret. It was openly talked about. And they utilized what, I guess, opportunities existed for, you know, a child like myself who was in essentially the system, to be able to access, I guess, little tiny bits of culturally related things. So I did get to experience access to elders once in a while. I got to experience dance when I was young, which was really great for me. So I was able to kind of grow up getting snippets of, you know, this is where you come from, this is your culture. And that really helped me find a sense of at least understanding who I was as a person and what my background was and why I was different from everyone else. But that being said, I was always different from everyone else. I said, you know, in the bio, you know, I was the only Indigenous kid in the room, and that's still fairly true even to this day when I'm maybe not in the Northwest Territories, but, you know, down south, I guess, south of that 6-degree parallel. So in those southern provinces, I'm still frequently the only Indigenous person in spaces where I'm invited to. And I recognize that and I honor that. And I have, you know, this space in the sport world now where I get to talk about this and talk about my journey. And so what got me into sport was that idea of, you know, I was always the odd one out. I never really had a group or, you know, one kind of core group of friends that, you know, fit into a box. I was always spread out across different groups, different interests. I was always interested in art. I was interested in school. I was interested in sport. I loved it all. And I wanted to excel at it all because I wanted people to accept me. And I think a lot of people who know who I am can kind of understand now why I am the way that I am, where I just kind of always want to try new things. I always want to experience new things. I always want to do my best to be the best I can be at those things. And sometimes to the detriment, you know, of my own mental health or whatever it may be. But, you know, that's always been how I am. I know that for people to recognize me and accept me, it's definitely easier for me to go into spaces, you know, knowing what I'm doing or being good at something, because people are a lot more open to me being in that space if they think they can maybe learn something from me, or you know, if I already feel comfortable kind of jumping into that space. And so, you know, when I was young, I found that being a part of a team is really what helped me to focus on me as a person and focus on those skills and getting me to become, you know, a stronger, more confident person myself. And so my sports teams that I eventually started to join really gave me a sense of belonging and a sense of home. And I finally started to have a network of friends that, you know, we worked on goals together, whether it was short-term goals or long-term goals. We were able to travel around and we really were a unit. It was so cool to kind of have that sense of belonging for the first time in my life and to be able to grow, you know, throughout my teenage years, a part of those teams. And, you know, that inspired me from that to go into, you know, kinesiology at the University of Alberta. And that's really what started my journey to where I am now, kind of more in the academia and experience side of things. Was, you know, my sporting experience provided me with the opportunity to be a part of a team and to finally be able to grow as a person in that, you know, those different areas. And now I want to be able to give that back to other Indigenous youth. Where I work now, the Indigenous youth can't have those same experiences. And so now it's like, well, working with those youth, what can I do to help them achieve what they want? So, you know, a lot of the work that I do now is sitting down with youth and saying, listen, I understand, you know, what you're struggling with. I understand, you know, you want to be a part of this. You want to grow, whether that's through sport or some other area in their lives. You know, what can I do to help you achieve those goals? And what can I do to help diminish those barriers a little bit more so that they can kind of access those things in a little bit more of an equitable playing field. And that's really my goal now is, you know, I've been through it, I got through it, you know, things are going great now, so how can I help others do the same thing? And sport, I have found, has really been a great vessel for me to do that. And I'm hoping to continue as best I can, just providing those opportunities through different leadership things, whether that's through coaching or mentorship or whatever, you know, individuals need, just to feel confident in their own skills so that they can be the ones, you know, getting up and coaching a team and providing those opportunities for others as well. I really think it's, you know, a cycle, and the more you support others, the more they're going to be a part of it and want to continue that cycle. And that's really the goal ultimately.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I mean, I'm always so drawn to your energy and your enthusiasm and the way you bring people around you and share and engage them in building a plan about how to move forward together. And it's, you know, your plans for the Northwest Territories and building capacity with the youth is unbelievable. And so I, you know, just think that you're such a perfect person to be in that type of role and to motivate and bring others along with you in your approach.
Thank you.
And it all speaks to that sense of belonging, right? And I mean, both of you have already spoken about sort of times when you didn't belong or you were trying to fit in versus belonging. So tell us sort of what those pivot points were for each of you in terms of times when you did start to feel like you belonged. And maybe Janice, I'll start with you because Beth did tell us a little bit about that in her last piece.
Sure. I think, you know, I was saying to you earlier, you know, the word belonging for me is sort of an esoteric discussion. And, you know, I almost want to philosophize about it, but I don't want to go too deep because I'm not much of a philosopher. But, you know, I think about moments when I belonged in sport. And, you know, some of it is fairly mundane. It's what we all know. It's, you know, learning the movements and learning how to do what is required to be a part of a team. And, you know, this isn't always necessarily social. Sometimes it's just about, you know, being good enough to be part of a team. And so, you know, there's some funny moments in my life when I was in grade school, and I was one of the tallest girls in my class, I think in grade 7 or 8. I was 5'9" and 119 pounds and just super big hair. And everybody wanted to be on the basketball team in Timmins. And so, of course, I tried out. And I'm a total spaz on the court. It's just it's completely hopeless. And I'll never forget, you know, I got the ball at one point because someone threw me the ball, and I got so excited I ran down the court and couldn't figure out why anybody, you know, wasn't running behind me, and while everybody was screaming. And I thought, wow, you know, I must be really good. And of course I scored on our own basket. And so it's just, you know, moments not like that, because I didn't, you know, I knew I didn't belong on the basketball court. But I learned how to play badminton pretty quickly. I picked that up pretty good. And then started running, which was a new space for me, and one that I kept up with when I was in university. So for me, it was just about learning the physical skills, you know, to be a part of something larger than myself. I wasn't really in it, you know. I was good at school when I was, I mean, in elementary school. I don't even know if you can say that. I mean, who is really good at elementary school? I don't have kids, so I don't understand the concept. But, you know, when I got into high school, I, you know, could have been a much better student, but I recognized there were some challenges there, definitely overt and systemic forms of racism in the school. Sometimes it was right in my face, and other times it was hidden. And you had to wonder, you know, growing up in a place like Timmins in high school, if there was really a future for you. My biggest aspiration at the time was to be a secretary. And if that didn't work out, then I would work at a coffee shop. I think Tim Hortons was like an up and coming place to be at that time. So, you know, I didn't have like these big dreams when I was in high school. So sport, you know, was something that kept me interested, something that kept me, you know, a part of something larger at school. You know, but I can't say that, you know, it was everything that people always kind of talk about, you know, what it is when people get up and do these big kind of inspirational talks. Those never really resonate with me because they're not complex enough stories. And they certainly don't resonate with what I understand to be a complex story in sport. So I was, you know, part of the cross country and track and field teams in high school and badminton as well. And we did really, really well. Certainly formed some long-lasting friendships, some people who I still stay in connection with, and some who are very good friends. I learned to feel good about myself and good about my body, and just be able to manage myself in public spaces. But at the same time, you know, sport is just a really complex space, and there was a lot that I was working out emotionally through sport. When I was going through my dissertation, when I was working on my dissertation back in the early 2000s, I came across this dissertation by another woman. I think she was at Queen's, and her last name was Bomberry. And there was this one line in her dissertation, and she wasn't writing about sport. She was writing about the politics of being Indigenous in Canada. And I think she was talking about coming from Six Nations. But there's this one line about her being involved in sport and how her body could speak what her mind could not. And it's interesting because I think about, you know, all of my times in high school, and, you know, and all of the complex things like I was thinking about as I was, you know, running, as I was doing badminton. And I really couldn't figure out what I wanted to say at that time, just because it was so complex. And it's, you know, I'm still working through it. I mean, I think working through your own life is a lifelong project. Every story leads to a new story. But it's taken me years to unpack, you know, what it was that I was feeling and thinking about at that time. So, so for me to talk about like a sense of belonging and what made that happen, it's not so easy to compartmentalize it. I don't work well with binaries. So, I mean, it's all of the same stuff that people talk about: a sense of teamwork, a sense of belonging, or a sense of accomplishment, a sense of camaraderie. I mean, you know, all of that is true. But it's, you know, if that's just where we're going to stay, then that's barely skimming the surface, I think, of how complex sport is, not only for me, but I think for a lot of people too.
Wow, that was a beautiful journey you just took us on, kind of weaving your way through your experiences. Thank you for that. Beth, what about you? How does that sort of parlay to your experience, and connecting back to some of your earlier comments around sort of where you felt sport gave you that sense of belonging, but also in your journey now in terms of kind of inspiring and working to engage the next generation of leaders?
Yeah, I found that I think I first started to connect with sport a lot just, you know, starting school, kind of starting daycare, getting that sense of community and camaraderie just with the kids in my neighborhood. So I grew up in kind of middle class, white neighborhood in Edmonton, low crime rate, you know, kind of very localized in the sense where we had essentially our own little community. And I lived right on the edge of it, where, you know, we had everything you could ever want kind of in one spot, and we were able to kind of almost exist in our own little community world, right? It was the true sense of a neighborhood, I guess. And that was wonderful. But I mean, talk about, you know, thinking about it now, there's just such a such a classist thing there. But that's where I was raised. That was my experience, and that's you know, part of who I am now in terms of, you know, existing in all of these different spaces in different ways. And you know, I had to find a way to thrive in those environments. I had to find a way to not only survive, but I had to find a way to be the best. Because again, that was the only way I could get kind of that positive recognition, was to be the best at everything that I could be. And that's just what I focused on growing up. And so my sport journey early on was, you know, I guess playing with the boys. There weren't a ton of females at that point. I mean, even now, that really were, you know, rough and tumble and encouraged and allowed to be, you know, I guess just out on the playground, out in the field all the time. And that was great. My parents really encouraged that. So I was always, you know, right in the middle of it all, of the different sports, the different games. Always, I guess, you know, if you want to look at stereotypes, the girl picked first in gym class kind of thing. That was kind of my identity in the classroom, in the space where, you know, I was always the girl who was gonna give it her best, give it her all, and kind of be like one of the boys. And so that was my first taste of kind of that sense of camaraderie and belonging. But then as we started to get into our teenage years, everyone started to go into their specializations or have their own interests, or really be a part of that team dynamic that I still hadn't quite experienced. Up until, you know, 12 years old, I had been a part of community teams recreationally, but I had never been a part of the competitive stream. And that just naturally, who I was as a person and the environments I put myself in was where I needed to go. So as a 12-year-old, I hadn't even thought yet about, you know, specializing in a sport or what my sports would be. I did it all. I think what's also important to note is right around that time, I actually took a year off of kind of normal school, I guess, and chose to pursue my passion for art, which was very strong when I was young. I was very creative, and I actually took a year off to go to art school and focus on art. And that kind of removed me a little bit from that group of friends and that group of athletes. And so when I kind of came back after a year of being away, I was kind of like lost. I didn't know what to do, and I didn't have a team. And around that time, I had, you know, started playing with the 16 and 17-year-old soccer team in our community leagues. I didn't really have anywhere else to go. The kids my age were all scattered at this point. And so suddenly I was playing soccer with 16, 17-year-olds as a 12, 13-year-old. And it was at that point that someone said, well, maybe you should think about going into club soccer. If you're playing with girls 4 to 5 years older than you, maybe you should think about, you know, playing competitively. And that was very intriguing, but I didn't know where to start. And it wasn't easy for me. I was, you know, all the racism stuff, you know, very true. I experienced it a lot. Luckily, it wasn't very, again, so super overt for me, but it's not easy to go into a tryout space where people don't know you and to have people be comfortable with you when everyone feels uneasy with you walking into a room at first. That's the reality of what it's like to walk into those tryout rooms. It's not only are you unknown, but like your skin color and how people perceive you really plays a role in that. And so I had to contend with that a lot. And it was very evident for me that I needed to find a place and find a role and try and excel at it quickly. And I actually fell into soccer, focusing on soccer, but focused on goalkeeping. And that was what got me into kind of more this competitive world, was focusing more on an individual position that I could have control over in terms of my own growth. And maybe I'd find a spot. And I was just lucky that I had some very negative experiences in sport, especially in my position. But I was also very lucky that I had some incredible coaches along the way that helped to lift me up even when I was struggling. And I was able to get fairly far in that world. What wasn't expected of me, and I think it's interesting now talking to my coaches that helped me get there, the racism thing has come up a lot. You know, they've been reflecting on a lot of it because I came in as a 14, 15-year-old trying to be this competitive goalkeeper, and they didn't want to take a chance on me at first. And that was evident. And they've made comments, you know, we didn't expect you to get, to where you are now. We didn't expect you. And it wasn't always a race thing, but it certainly played a role. And that was very interesting for me because it was the first time I kind of could stop and reflect on that. And in that vein of things, it was interesting being this competitive, high performance player and not even know about the Indigenous sports stream growing up. So I'll briefly kind of just touch on that, is that, you know, growing up and especially now working for, I guess, the Aboriginal sports circle world, it's really interesting, you know, learning about how there is this, you know, entire sports stream developed for Indigenous athletes to help them hopefully find some equity through our sports systems and to help better kind of relay the lived experiences of what it's like to be an Indigenous, you know, athlete from a community or from an urban center or wherever, and how we can support them through sport, or what it looks like for them in their journeys through sport. I never experienced that. You know, no one in my lifetime ever said, hey, you could try out for NAG. You could, have you ever heard about, the Indigenous teams? Have you ever, no one, never once through any of my white schools did anyone ever say that. Never through any of my, competitive training, high performance training, community training, all, coaching courses, was it ever made known to me that I had this other world that I could have been a part of. And, looking back, certainly a missed opportunity, but definitely a driving force for me now, thinking, well, not only do I work for this world of Indigenous sport, where my role is to help support these kids get there, I think that part of that experience that I had growing up is that extra driving bit of passion for me, because like every kid that's Indigenous should know about these programs and should have opportunities to be a part of these programs. And, I don't spend too much time, having a pity party for myself as much as I would have loved to be a part of, NAG or whatever for Team Alberta. I also can, recognize that my schedule when I was in high school anyways was like 3 teams a day. So could I have fit that in? Probably not anyways. And I acknowledge that. But I certainly want to make sure that there aren't, other kids who feel lost or alone. I want them to know that they do have those opportunities and those teams. And I want to be able to come up with ways to just provide those opportunities. And that's really kind of the driving force for me as a person. And yeah, moving forward, just trying to work with those youth to overcome. And that's what I'm doing now. And I don't have the answers for everything. And I make mistakes all the time. And, I'll have this wonderful idea, oh, this program will work, or, the kids want this and we'll try it out. And it goes horribly. But, I think having so many people support me and give me advice and not criticize me if I do run into those road bumps or do have some issues, they're usually willing to have a constructive conversation following those things. That's been wonderful. And again, I always go back to just how lucky I've been to have those caring coaches, to have caring adults, and to have really safe environments with strong leadership to grow in. And that's kind of what I hope to do now. I've always had teachers that didn't hold me back because of my behaviors didn't come off to them as negative. So in the classrooms, I had the very typical behaviors you would see from not only an Indigenous child, that's not what I'm saying, but from a child that struggles with a lot of things, with belonging. I had, a lot of attention issues, a lot of hyperactivity, and a lot of times those behaviors are seen as negative and those kids aren't supported. We know about the programs that they're often put into, but my teachers gave me support. They gave me extra work to do. They gave me strategies, and most kids don't have that. Same thing in sport. I had coaches that when I was struggling supported me, or if I quit, which didn't happen very often, but there were a couple times in my life where I said, that's it, I'm done, and I walked away. I had coaches that welcomed me back. And that's really it, is that I've always been lucky enough to have those leaders in my life, and now I'm just trying to give that back to others if I can. And that's what I hope to continue to do, and hopefully, when I continue to make mistakes, I can continue to learn from those, and just continue to keep trying my best and keep trying new things. Whatever is going to work for these kids, because I think at this point we just need, we need action, and we just need to try new things and see what works, and hopefully we can make a difference moving forward. And especially now with everything going on, I think it's a really great time to be trying these new things, because hopefully with everything going on right now, there'll be some strategies and policies that will really help in my journey to make the playing field a little bit more equitable. So.
Yeah, and thanks for sort of raising the topic around the Indigenous sports system, because I think that, is such an important place and has had such an important history and really came out of racism against Indigenous people in the mainstream sports system. And so how do we learn from that and where we're at right now, and look at sort of the opportunity in front of us around, and Janice and I were actually on a thing around anti-racism in hockey last night, which was interesting as well. But Janice, you've also committed many years of your life in the Indigenous sports system. So do you want to kind of layer onto what Beth's talked about and why that's important and how that can play a role in creating belonging for Indigenous participants and raising the awareness of mainstream sport as we go forward?
Sure. I think, Beth, you provided a lot of really good entry points for this discussion. So briefly, I've been involved with the Indigenous sports system as in a more official capacity since 2000, when I started working at the Aboriginal Sports Circle as an interim program director, and then from there it moved pretty quickly into different types of contract work with the Aboriginal Sports Circle, sometimes with Canadian Heritage, sometimes doing evaluations for the North American Indigenous Games, and I've been involved ever since. But my entry into the Indigenous sports system was with the 1995 North American Indigenous Games, when they were held in Blaine, Minnesota. And at that time, I was a university student running for Western on their track and field and cross country teams. And I guess I would be at the height of my career at that point in time. Certainly not Olympic caliber or national team caliber, maybe close, but not quite, always the bridesmaid. And a mentor from Northern Ontario, Kelly Bull, who knew my mom quite well, said that I should be on Team Ontario and, you know, go to the Indigenous Games in Blaine, Minnesota. And it really was a life-changing experience for me, and it's helped me to understand the Indigenous space as a space that is absolutely vital to Indigenous culture, to Indigenous sport, to youth development, and so on. And what happened at those games was, I mean, there's like a myriad of things, and most people would probably be mortified if they heard the stories from a risk point of view. I think about it. At the time as an athlete, I thought it was just like the best thing ever as an organizer, and, you know, all of these red flags are going off in my head, and I'm having minor heart attacks left and right. But it, you know, I remember getting on the bus at the Bonnier Motel in Timmins. My mom had dropped me off, and it was one of those big Greyhound buses, and it was just unchartered, or chartered on the front, unchartered territory, chartered on the front. And got on the bus, didn't know anybody, not a single soul. And my mom said, "This must be the bus. You should get on it. You should go." So I got on the bus. I just remember we were crossing the line to get in the border to get into the States, and I tapped on the shoulder of the girl in front of me, who eventually became a friend of mine, and I said, "Can I ask, like, what bus am I on, and where are we going?" and then that's when I found out I was on the right bus, and in fact we were going to the Indigenous Games in Blaine, Minnesota. So that was a huge relief to me. But it was this one moment when we were at the track, and I was sitting in the stands, maybe about halfway up, and they were just lining up for the 800 meters, and I was so excited to be there. I mean, Becky Wells was there, and she was like, you know, going to try out for the Olympic team, and I was just so excited to race against her in the I think it was the mile at that time. I was totally out of shape. I wasn't ready for it, but I was excited to be in the race nonetheless. I wasn't in the 800 meters, and that's the one that was on the track. And the starter for the race, the person who shoots the gun, was just about to like start the race. Everybody was lined up, and he said, whoa, wait a minute, does anybody else want to run? And I thought, you've got to be kidding. Like, are you really doing this? Because that was just totally something that I hadn't known from, you know, my mainstream competitions. Everything was by the book, you know, it just, you know, you couldn't bet the rules. And so here is this person stopping the race to see if anybody else wanted to run. And I thought, well, maybe he forgot an athlete. And this woman comes running down the bleachers in her moccasins and her long skirt. And she runs by me and she goes, oh, I want to run, I want to run. And I'm thinking, really? Is this really going to happen? She gets on the track, the gun goes off. She almost gets lapped. I mean, you're only talking like 2 laps of the track. And everybody was just like clapping and giving her a standing ovation as she came through the finish line. And it was in that moment in time when I thought, there's something fundamentally different here. And it's not just about, you know, doing the race differently. There's a fundamentally different culture, you know, of something that is happening here. All of the risk things aside, there's something beautiful about what people are trying to do with the North American Indigenous Games. And that totally changed, you know, my life. So from then on, I started studying, you know, Indigenous sport. Very soon after, started working 5 years later in Indigenous sport. And I think you know, it's really difficult for people who haven't been, or who are not immersed, or who don't take the time to understand, you know, what is truly unique and important about Indigenous sport done in Indigenous ways. It's a really difficult conversation to have. So, you know, for me, I just, Indigenous sport is something beautiful. It's tied to history, it's tied to culture, it's, you know, tied to its own unique strand of anti-racism. But it's rooted like in Indigenous history, and it's rooted in Indigenous experiences. And, and that for me is, you know, just a beautiful, beautiful part, I think, of, you know, of the sports system. And so I dedicate my life to it now, as opposed to the mainstream sports system. And so I make a distinction between the two, because in my understanding, there is a fundamental difference between the two.
Thank you for that, Janice. You talked quite a bit about culture, and Beth also spoke a bit about that. Tell us a little bit more about sort of the importance of culture in your life and your journey, and how that's connected to belonging for you as you've gone through.
Is this for me or for Beth?
Yeah, why don't you kick us off?
I think for me, you know, one of the things that I've really wrestled with, I mean, I talked about how sport is a complex space, and, you know, a lot of it for me boils down to the loss of culture, and how Indigenous people are trying to rebuild themselves through culture. And so, you know, when I was talking about all of the you know, the hard things that I was trying to work through in high school, and I didn't quite have the language for, and, you know, all of the things that I wrestled with in university, and still now, it much of it boils down to, you know, the way in which Indigenous people were dispossessed of their culture, and how, you know, they are trying to find their way back through culture. And part of this is through physical culture. So I think, you know, it's really important that people understand that history, and what it is that Indigenous people are trying to do with that history through physical culture. So, you know, if I'm to relate to, you know, experience to my own life, I remember growing up in Timmins, just, you know, these kind of like vague memories, they come as kind of pictures that you look at underwater. They're all blurry, but, you know, we used to do powwow when I was a little girl in Timmins. And then at some point in time, that just stopped. It's just done. And then I don't remember it at all, you know, growing up when we would go back to Timmins. And I certainly don't remember it at all when I was in high school that, you know, we didn't do powwow in Timmins. That just somehow disappeared. And yet at the same time, you know, I really wrestled with myself being, you know, Indigenous in this mainstream sports system, because I was pretty good at sports in high school, you know, in badminton and cross country running and track and field, not so much, mostly badminton. And just really wrestling with, where did this other part of me go, right? And, you know, how come no one wants to talk about it? And how come, you know, I'm getting so much recognition for, you know, just being a fast runner? Like what exactly does this mean, right? Like, I'm chasing this abstract time. I have no clue what I'm doing. I'm working really hard at it, but people somehow think it's easy for me because I'm Indian, which is racism in case you don't get it. It's, you know, I mean, it was just this like really weird space, and I couldn't, you know, reconcile it, because I didn't understand the history. You know, no one was talking about the role of physical culture or sport in, you know, the history of that dispossession. And it really didn't start to clue in for me until I was at the 1995 Indigenous Games. And even then I didn't quite understand it. It's just a lot of what I learn, and you know, everybody's a different learner, but a lot of what I learn is visceral, like I feel it. And I know when something has changed, or when something, you know, I really need to think about is there for me, is because I feel it. And something fundamentally changed at the 1995 Games. So, so it's, you know, in culture, sport is culture. Mainstream sport is culture. Indigenous physical culture is culture. But there's, you know, this movement now to try and reclaim Indigenous cultures and to rebuild identities through sport. And not a lot of people quite understand that. You know, they think they can do that through mainstream sport by not changing anything. You know, just you get involved in mainstream sport and then everything will kind of be fine, as if sport is apolitical, but it isn't. And so it makes it very difficult then for Indigenous people to, move forward with their own aspirations for sport in their own way, because people just fundamentally don't understand the history, and they don't understand where it is that people are trying to go. And they think that the system that is already there is the best way to do it. And the Indigenous sports system somehow is just some sort of tertiary system, like it's some sort of secondary branch that can be given a little pot of money like every now and again and supported, and then they'll be fine because they're doing culture, they're doing something different. It doesn't have to be supported in the same way or equitably. So yeah, culture, I think for me is this really deep kind of headspace that I've had to think through, that I've felt, and I think a lot of people are kind of in the same space. At least when I'm working in Indigenous sport, I don't have a hard time talking to people about this. Like, I don't have to explain to people what I'm thinking about, because they understand, even if they use different language. And that's the beauty about Indigenous sport. I love being in a space where I don't have to explain myself, where I don't have to have sometimes really complicated, hard discussions, that sometimes just aren't received well. Those are really hard. So yeah, that's a long-winded way of answering your question.
No, that was great. And that end piece just spoke to me about how you just feel like you belong in with other people that are talking Indigenous sport, and it just fits for you. Beth, what about you? Do you want to comment on culture and that belonging piece?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that definitely brought up some memories for me. But even just in terms of, the comment about just having an audience basically that understands you. I never really had that, and I guess I'll before I bring it back to another point, I'll quickly touch on my academic journey. I know some people are probably here for that, so let me just touch on that. I know, so for me, I went into the kinesiology program at the University of Alberta because I knew how meaningful sport was for me, and I knew, what I wanted to do was go in and help people in sport. I didn't know what that was, so I actually went into sport medicine. That was kind of my goal at first, and to this day, I still kind of wish there was a way I could have done both. Huge passion of mine for sure, but when we talk about my journey in sport, I grew up in this competitive stream. The only one of the only Indigenous players. There were two of us who are openly identifiable or known to be Indigenous. There are probably more. We know about how there's a lot that aren't visible, but there's a lot of issues around that too as to why they might not want to make it known. But there are two of us known in the whole Edmonton competitive minor sports system, and so that was always a big thing. And we never played together really on the same team in a youth growing up, so it was always just the two of us. But anyways, ultimately going in, it came to the point now where I'm graduating from the youth system. I'm going into university. Do I want to pursue varsity? And I was always very similar in terms of always being near the top kind of our age cohort, always kind of in the top 5, top 3, but never the the first or the second on the list. So I knew going in terms of playing varsity, even though I had opportunities, realistically knowing who was coming up behind me and stuff, you have to think about that. And so to me, committing as a student athlete didn't seem like the right fit, but I was actually lucky to go into athletic therapy and sport medicine, and actually got to work with the Panda soccer team for most of my undergrad as in the athletic therapy world. And it was so cool to be able to travel with these girls who I've known my whole life, who I still play with a lot of them. But that was my varsity time and my time for my undergrad. And I kind of was like, this is great. Maybe this is the right pathway for me. And that's when Tara Lee McHugh, good old Tara Lee McHugh at the U of A, stepped in and said, hey, you want to do some more Indigenous sports stuff? It seems like it might be something you'd be interested in. So then she got me addicted to Indigenous research, and now it's something I really miss and something I would love to continue to do. But throughout my journey in time, found that I've done the grad school programs and I loved them. I did my research in the Northwest Territories, which was I did community-based participatory research, qualitative research with Indigenous youth from an Indigenous community in the Northwest Territories, and it was so cool to be able to do research that was really participant-based and participant-led. and also to be able to develop those partnerships with youth. And it was cool. That was really my first foray into, you know, giving ownership and autonomy to Indigenous youth in a space where, you know, traditionally those voices aren't heard. And I loved it. And, you know, I knew I was in the right field and doing the right work when I was able to kind of look back at that, look back at my thesis, look back at my, you know, the publication that came from it and say, like, this is valuable and this is important, and what can I keep doing to do this work? And, you know, we talked about how I really wanted to do my PhD program. I was doing my PhD program, and then I realized if I want to continue to live in the Northwest Territories, you know, these institutions don't want me to live here full time. That's a whole other discussion and a whole other thing, but ultimately, through a lot of discussion and a lot of, you know, focusing on what was important to me, I know that what's most important is working, you know, on the front lines, connecting with communities and doing that work with communities and with the youth directly. I think that's a really cool space I fill now, because I've always been a part of that weird, you know, gray area and the whole, you know, binary system of, you know, I'm not quite Native enough, not quite white enough. I'm not, you know, I'm not from the NWT, but I'm still from Treaty 8, and people want me to be, you know, there's all these different, you know, gray areas that I exist in. And so now my role is to really just help bridge the gap, I find, and that's wonderful and great. And where I, you know, work now and where I live now, it's really cool to be able to put those ideas into practice. And so that's what I do. And that's been my journey through academia now, and kind of why I am where I am now, where I'm like, you know what, I love academia. Who knows, maybe one day I'll return, but for right now, I really love getting to do what I do and wake up every day knowing that I'm, you know, having the impact that I want. And tying it back just to the cultural piece, growing up, again, I was fairly removed, but one thing that I did do was powwow as well. So like, I even have my little powwow shawl from when I was a little kid. The ribbons were here, and just that, you know, even a testament to, you know, my mom. She's non-Indigenous, and she, you know, recognized that it was really important to me, and I really wanted to try dancing, and she taught herself, you know, with some expert knowledge to, you know, make me my own custom powwow outfit. And I think as a non-Indigenous person to be able to support me in that way was just such an incredible opportunity. It was my first time, you know, ever belonging to Indigenous, you know, sport or recreation in any sort of way. And that was kind of what helped me through some of those discussions growing up was I remember actually even my mom and I, in grade 4, I had never really publicly talked about my, you know, indigeneity before in front of my peers, but this was my show and tell in grade 4. It was actually dancing in front of my classmates in my outfit for the first time as the only Indigenous person in that school. So that was pretty intense, and looking back on that now, I know like that wouldn't have happened if it hadn't been for my parents and for my community being supportive of me. I know it's scary now thinking about standing up in front of a room of non-Indigenous people in an Indigenous outfit and performing for them. I think I would have a much harder time with that now than I did when I was in grade 4. So it's really cool, and it's really fun to have an opportunity like this to talk about these things and tie it back. And I mean, it's also just a testament to how powerful it was to me as a youth to have an outfit made like that. And I still have it to this day hanging in my closet. I have the rest of it in there too, right? So I'm lucky to be able to carry it with me now and have those memories. But that cultural piece, even though I didn't grow up in my culture, was just so significant for me in terms of having a positive relationship with my identity, because I could have been ashamed, and I was ashamed in for a lot of reasons. And I think just the fact that as a kid in grade 4, that I felt comfortable doing that, even though I had a lot of fear. I can remember how scary it was, but I still did it. That's what kids need, right? That's what we need as Indigenous people, are just having those opportunities to express ourselves and be ourselves, and not, you know, be afraid of the criticism or what's going to come out of it. And I was just lucky. Again, I had great classmates growing up for the most part. I had great teachers growing up for the most part, and I had great parents growing up. So those 3 things allowed me to be confident in who I was and who I am. And it wasn't always easy, but certainly a big reason for where I am now. And I think that just continue to have these conversations about being that supportive person is just very important. And yeah, being able to have these conversations with you guys about it is so good.
What a brilliant way to wrap us up today. The hour always just flies by, but both of you are such incredible leaders in the work that you do and the perspectives you bring and the way you bring your voice to bring others into the conversation and engage them and share your vulnerability and your bravery, but also getting them to kind of step up and help move the work forward, because there is lots of work to do. One of you said that earlier, and this is really an opportunity and a time and place in our history where we need to learn the histories and we need to work together to move forward to a better place to support Indigenous youth and Indigenous people across Canada. So thank you both so much for being here today. I'm so grateful to have you in my life and to have the opportunity to share your voices with our audience today. And thank you for all that you do. So that's the wrap for another week of Bridges of Belonging. I'm just going to share the speakers for next week. So we have Michelle Stillwell and Joey Johnson joining us next week. Michelle is a Paralympian in athletics and also an MLA here in British Columbia. And Joey Johnson is also a Paralympian in wheelchair basketball. We're going to have quite a conversation next week around some of the rulings of the International Wheelchair Basketball Federation and how that's leading to people that have been in the system no longer belonging. So that will be pretty interesting. So thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you again to Beth and Janice. You're just both so incredible, and I'm so grateful that you're here with us. So thank you. Take care, everyone. Stay safe.